Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, January 2000, two grandmothers, are traveling from Havana to the United States. They are seeking the return of their grandson from the U.S. to Cuba. Their grandson is Elian Gonzalez, a 6-year-old boy whose family had fled from Cuba to Miami in a raft. His mother drowned while trying to make the passage, and Elian ended up in Miami with relatives and would become embroiled in a heated custody and immigration controversy with all sorts of political wrinkles. I think for anyone listening now who was watching the news at the time, they remember a lot of the flashpoints of this story, including some of the images, including that photo of a scared Elian being taken from his home by authorities. But there are so many dimensions here and so many political angles, which is sort of what we get into in this show. So here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Geraldo Cadava, professor of history at Northwestern, who focuses on Latinos in the United States. And he's been on the show before. And you may remember that we gave a shout out to Jerry's newsletter, Latinos in Depth, when we did our favorite things of 2022 episode. So if that didn't convince you to subscribe, this will convince you to subscribe. But Jerry, welcome back to the show. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me. You guys are too kind. I appreciate it.
Too kind is a good standard to aspire to.
Yes,
there you
agreed.
go. That's true. Can't go wrong. Can't go wrong.
So look, talk about a story with layers and forgotten layers. But I'll just kind of start to say, like, you can kind of move up the layers in terms of scale, and you can say, okay, there's the personal layer of this young boy and his family. And then there's the local layer of, the Cuban community in Miami, which is super interesting and nuanced and fraught. And then there's the national layer of Florida and U.S. politics and Gore and Bush. And then, of course, there's the international layer of U.S. and Cuba relations. So, Jerry, it's up to you. You can stick a toehold in any of those layers and start climbing around. But where do you start with this?
Yeah, I mean, you really could go anywhere. I mean, maybe I'll start with Latino politics and national politics, since that's what you guys do. That's what I do. But we really can go anywhere with this. I mean, one of the reasons this is such a compelling story is that it's a particular incident that does show us so much about so many things that are going on at the turn of the century. So in Latino politics, it became a really pivotal episode shaping how Latinos voted in Florida in the 2020, or I'm sorry, not 2020. My mind is still on the 2020 election. But in the 2000 election, which was certainly as pivotal. And, many Latinos refer to it as kind of the most consequential event in U.S.-Cuban relations that shaped the Latino vote, the Cuban-American vote in Florida since the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. And we know that earlier episode was one in which the perceived failures of the JFK administration really alienated a lot of Cuban Americans and sent them toward the Republican Party as they naturalized in greater and greater numbers. And the argument about the Elian Gonzalez episode is that was as consequential for the Latino vote. And George W. Bush in Florida that year, in 2001, 80% of the Cuban American vote. And we know that Florida is much in the news today, too. But that'll give you a sense, just the fact that George Bush won 80% of the Cuban American vote in 2000 in an election in that state that was decided by only 537 votes of a total of 5.8 million cast. That 80% for Bush was really pivotal, and many thought that he won such widespread support in Florida because of how the Elian Gonzalez episode shook out.
How much of that was a deviation from where the Cuban vote had been, say, in the 1980s and 1990s? Was it more overwhelmingly Republican? Was it switching from Democrat to Republican? How do you see that as a change in 2000?
80% is about in line with the highest levels of support a Republican had won. So Reagan did about that well, but it came at a moment when there was hope among Democrats that story had been starting to shift, so there was some expectation or hope, I guess, really, that Democrats could cut into that, but they didn't, largely because of Elian Gonzalez.
Why did this story get so much attention.
Yeah, well, that gets us into U.S.-Cuban relations to a degree. But in the early 1990s, 1994, I believe, Bill Clinton had implemented the wet feet, dry feet policy, a kind of new immigration policy with respect to Cubans. And it said basically that if a would-be Cuban exile, Cuban immigrant would be intercepted in the waters between Cuba and Florida, they would have to be returned to Cuba. But if they made it to land in Florida, that they could stay in the United States. And because Elian and his mother were intercepted in a raft in the waters between Cuba and Florida, by that proclamation, by that policy, Elian should have been returned to Cuba. That was a no-brainer. But the Cuban exile community in Florida really made the argument that here was someone trying to escape oppressive, tyrannical rule in Cuba to find freedom in the United States. So the Cuban exile community in Florida really took it up as an issue that was kind of pivotal in the battles between Cuba and the United States, and their longstanding opposition to Clinton's seemingly arbitrary immigration policy, wet feet, dry feet. I mean, that's like pull an answer out of a hat to craft immigration policy. And so that's why
don't
it was
ask,
picked
don't
up.
tell.
Yes, I
Right,
know.
yeah.
I was going to say.
Yeah, I wonder if the Clinton era will be revisited for its clever, like, wet feet, dry feet, don't ask, don't tell, you know?
Wishy-washy.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, right.
I wonder, too, how much of this story, I mean, it really pulls on the emotional drawstrings to know that there is a little boy who's in this raft, who's lost his mother. His mother has drowned at sea, along with several others. And so the helplessness of this little boy, who I think is taken in by like a great uncle, and then the rest of the family sort of like surrounds him in this hopes of keeping him in the United States. Children, unfortunately or fortunately, become these really like political pawns oftentimes, in which you can use people's emotionality to sort of pull on that, like, well, he needs to stay, this is better, he's lost everything, that kind of narrative, I think, feeds really well into people's sympathies and wanting, to do right by this child.
This also happens on Thanksgiving, and he's rescued by fishermen. And so there's this way that a very compelling narrative emerges from the water along with Elian.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about that just today, how the kind of bookends of this whole episode are Thanksgiving, when his mother's body and he are kind of recovered from the water. And then it ends after midnight on Easter Sunday on April 22nd, 2000. So when the U.S. kind of armed officials kind of break into Elian's uncle's house, and that's the episode that kind of produced the famous photograph that eventually won the Pulitzer Prize. So, the book ends on these two holidays and all that they say about America's sense of itself and its land of plenty and piety, connected by Thanksgiving in April or Easter Sunday, I think is just really interesting. I haven't fully thought through that yet. I just think it's an interesting coincidence for now. But yeah, I think, Kellie, to your point, how the emotionality of a kind of quote unquote innocent child being the center point of this story is interesting, especially as it's playing out what's playing out in the background are all of these ideas about America is the land of opportunity and freedom, and shouldn't, and this is what Republicans are playing on. I mean, shouldn't Elian have all of the wonderful opportunities of this great land, And this connects with national politics because it really put Al Gore in a tight position. I mean, I think Al Gore in the 2000 campaign was probably put in a tight position by Bill Clinton in lots of other ways. More than once. How does Al Gore position himself with respect to his boss slash, about to be former boss? So, there's a lot going on there. And the tight position Gore is put in is that, his boss's policy is wet feet, dry feet. It's a clear-cut example of someone needing to go back to Cuba, because that's what the law says. That's what Bill Clinton's policy says. But, you know, because of this innocent child who had the opportunity to remain in the United States and enjoy all of the privileges and freedoms of all of these are in quotation marks, you know, of being here, you know, it really played on the Florida voting population in particular, and I think on the national population watching all of this unfold. And I think Al Gore could kind of sense the politics, the importance of the politics of this. And even though he initially responded to the situation by saying, like, well, wet feet, dry feet, that says that we have to send him back, over time, he began to distance himself from that, because all along his opponent, George W. Bush, was saying, like, oh, you know, I really think we ought to give Elian the opportunity to stay here. We should even invite his family over, and they can see how wonderful it is to live in the United States. That's what
we should give citizenship too.
Yes, we should give them. Yeah, right, exactly. Of all of the Latino immigrants we should give citizenship to, let's give it to Elian. And so, yeah, I guess in some ways it was kind of in line with Bush's overall approach to immigration and having a different immigration policy than Bob Dole or Pat Buchanan or others. So I guess it's in line with that. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm just beginning to sketch out how difficult this situation was for Al Gore to respond to.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
You know, you mentioned the family. We are hooking this date to the moment when his grandparents come to the U.S. and basically say, like, we want him to return. You know, his father is home in Cuba writing op-eds in the newspaper, you know, over and over and over saying, I want him to return. He should be with his family here in Cuba. Public opinion polls show that the majority of Americans think he should return home. As we discussed, you know, INS policy very clearly said he should return home. And yet, you know, I think this was seen as a real controversy with strong, you know, emotional opinions on both sides. Can you just paint the contours of, like, who was actually arguing that this kid should stay here? Sure.
Well, I mean, and then you have his aunt and uncle who he was living with in Miami. And if anyone who listens to this goes to Miami, the uncle actually runs his home as a kind of informal museum. And you can, like, go knock on the door and the uncle will take you in and, like, show you the closet and stuff like that.
Oh my God.
Yeah. No, it's kind of crazy.
That's
I mean, it's
wild.
not an official museum, but he'll, like, take you in. I can't remember where it is, but it's in kind of like the heart of Little Havana. There's the main drag of 8th Street, and you can just walk a few blocks from there and go to Elian Gonzalez's uncle's house. But, you know, in some part of what I was thinking about, Jody, when you were talking, is how, like, hardline Cuban exiles have always been able to take positions that kind of flout the mainstream Republican Party position, and the Republican Party in many ways kind of caters to their demands and their needs in the context of Florida politics, for sure. So I think on the one hand, the people who wanted him to stay were his family members who had committed to living in Florida, the broader Cuban exile community, and the Republican Party, who is often willing to bend over backwards to satisfy the Cuban-American exile community in Florida.
It's an interesting moment for that as well, right? Like, you have a very savvy exile community who's holding protests, who's making sure that there's media coverage in order to keep this story in the news. And they are very much aided by the fact that not only is there a presidential campaign going on, so there are a lot of eyes on Florida in 2000, even before the recount starts, but Jeb Bush, the brother of the guy who's running for president, is the governor of Florida. And so there are these, there are a lot of There's a lot of motivation. There are a lot of reasons
interests.
why somebody might keep this a front page story.
Absolutely. And the Cuban exile community had been very savvy about its usage of media ever since the 1980s with Jorge Mascanosa and the foundation of the Cuban-American National Foundation and, the radio shows that were produced in Miami that could broadcast its messages to both to Cubans in the United States and Cubans living on the island. And Castro had kind of spent a lot of time trying to block those airwaves unsuccessfully. And so it really does. That's another layer of it, the U.S.-Cuban relations and how media was able to mobilize. And that gets back to Kellie's point about Elian being a kind of a symbol, a really important symbol.
On both sides. I'm just empathetic to how at 6 years old, you can't grapple with the gravity of the political maneuverings that are happening. And I wonder, to how much as an adult he's able to even tease out what intentions were good and what intentions were political. It's very sticky.
No, it's a great question. And, I know that we're going to get there anyway. What's happened to Elian in the past 20 years? I mean, he immediately got pulled into the world of U.S.-Cuban conflicts, right? So he became a kind of hero of the Cuban Revolution because he was repatriated to Cuba. Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's brother, kind of attended almost every birthday party that Elian Gonzalez had from the time he landed into the present, And so he went to a Cuban military academy, got a degree as an engineer, has become one of the leading, most prominent spokespeople for the Cuban Revolution today. And he's really a kind of Castro loyalist. And
there are pictures of him sitting next to Castro and sort of referring to him as his father. I mean, it's pretty powerful.
Yes. Yeah. So Castro, all of the Castros, the Cuban revolutionary leaders, used Elian as a symbol then and continues to do so, and it is interesting to your point about a 6-year-old, kind of being caught up in this and not having a say in the matter, but also not knowing necessarily what's right or wrong. The story could have turned out very differently for him if he had stayed in the United States instead of going back to Cuba, So, but instead, his whole life has been shaped by coming back to Cuba and becoming a kind of hero within Cuba.
It's hard to have any conversations about the GOP of this era and not, say, does that GOP still exist? And particularly with regards to immigration questions. But, does this story indicate in that larger sweep, is it an ending bracket, or are there still parts of the GOP that kind of responded in this way that are still out there now? Can you just put this in that larger context of the GOP's approach to immigration?
Well, I think when it comes to Cuban immigration, it's probably more of a story of continuity between the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and today, in the sense that Cubans have always kind of been seen as an exception within immigration politics. They've been given an easier path to belonging here in the United States than other immigrants had. And I think the Cuban exile community has really pressed its case from the 1960s to the present about how certain exceptions should be made for them. And over time, they've also applied the same kind of logic to immigrants from El Salvador and Venezuela and other places where they think similar kind of Cold War and even post-Cold War conflicts are happening between the United States and Cuba. So I do think there are still, even in this GOP, Republicans who would be very sympathetic to the case of Elian Gonzalez if it were to happen today, even in a kind of era that's become even more restrictionist than I think. Maybe Niki and I could talk about this, but I think today is probably even more restrictionist than what was going on in the 1990s, or at least what was the fringe argument in the 1990s has very much defined what immigration politics is today. But I think even today there would be sympathy for Elian.
Yeah, I think that Cuban immigrant exceptionalism allows the conversation to be less about immigration and more about the U.S.'s relationship with dictators and with communism. And so there's a storyline that you can pull out of this that is about a democratic president who gave in to the demands of a dictator and showed weakness on the world stage. And I think that has been the more powerful interpretation on the right. And there's been very little conversation about immigration as the core issue that the Gonzalez story is about.
Right.
All of this to me too seems like on both sides, Elian has to be set up for success, because if he goes back to Cuba, he can't go back and sort of lead a pauper's life, because then that would prove the point of everyone is like, see, we were trying to get him out and now look at his life. So he has to be an engineer. He has to be, great or accomplished. And then I guess on the flip side, if he were to come to America and also not have a great life, the same argument could be made that like, well, if he had stayed with his father and if he had stayed in his country, he could have been safe. He could have been, like all of these, I think, outcomes of like who he becomes as a person becomes an indictment or a validation of the government that he's a part of or the country that he's a part of.
Which is why I think it was important that when he resurfaces in the 2000s and there are stories that are written about him as he goes through college and becomes an engineer, that I think that there were a lot of interpretations of that story in the U.S. that he was brainwashed by Castro and that he would, that this wasn't a true story in a lot of ways, but that he was forced into this position, which is a way of trying to counter the narrative coming out of Cuba.
I think that's really interesting, Kellie. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that particular aspect of it, but yes, I mean, he couldn't return to Cuba and kind of resume life as an average Cuban, whatever that means. I mean, he had to become...
the life that led him and his family to want to come to the U.S.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He had to become a symbol of the successes of the revolution. I think that's really interesting. And the brainwashing aspect of it is interesting too, Niki. I mean, I think that just shows how different the politics of it read in different contexts.
Well, because
still fighting that Cold War,
right? Yeah, I mean, he's given interviews where he's talked about how his relatives in the United States were getting in his ear about how awful life was back in Cuba and how his father didn't love him and all this stuff. So I mean, brainwashing and spinning and manipulation, for a 6-year-old kid was all around. As we wrap up, on the political dimensions of this and the political impact of this, I was kind of surprised to hear you say like it's the Cuban Revolution and this are like the two flashpoint, moments in the story for the Cuban-American community in Miami. I mean, what is the legacy of this moment for that incredibly powerful political bloc, and moreover, is it still talked about? I mean, is it still something that's salient even today?
That's interesting. That's a good question, because I guess I do, when I think about the kind of origin stories of Cuban exile politics today, I still think primarily of the Bay of Pigs, and I think of like when Marco Rubio kind of became a politician on the national stage. And very well regarded within the Cuban exile community. So much of his origin story had to do with his parents coming after, even though that ended up not being true, they came before the Cuban Revolution. But his whole kind of story of his upbringing and political formation had to do more with the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs, than it did this moment in 1999. So, I think that could have been something that was articulated at the time as a way of signaling how momentous this is. But I do think that as something that really motivates, a core motivator of the Cuban exile vote today, the Cuban-American vote today, I think maybe I would say that the Elian story has faded a little bit in comparison with an episode like the Bay of Pigs. But I do think that culturally it still is an important story. I saw that in Miami last fall, there's a new play called Elian Gonzalez. his voice is in or what is supposed to be his voice is in the background of the play. You don't actually see Elian Gonzalez. The play was made by a kind of Jewish Venezuelan refugee living in Miami who wanted to kind of bring the story back up to remind Cuban exiles of its poignance. But that's its kind of cultural relevance rather than how it's motivating Cuban-American politics today. Do you have a different answer to that, Niki?
No, I think that you're exactly right. The Cuban vote, in many ways, has remained a key part of Republican coalition politics. It just, especially in Florida, although it'll be interesting to see how much it changes as Florida becomes a redder and therefore less swingy state.
Yeah.
And by that you mean, and maybe the Cuban-American vote in particular will become less significant, because after all, I think, there are as many Mexicans and Puerto Ricans who will play a greater role in the state and not just Cubans.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Like there'll be less of a hinge point in the state.
Yes. And, I think the kind of flashpoint of Cuban-American politics today still has to do very much with socialism. I mean, you joked that we're kind of still living in the Cold War. Someday, and maybe historians are even already doing this, are writing books about how the Cold War never ended. In fact, like, we're still living in it, and Putin's resurgence says a lot about this. So, I think that socialism is still the kind of socialism and anti-socialism are still the motivating factors. And I think you can plug Elian into that story, but it's not that Elian is the story itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, we are going to leave it there. Super fascinating. And we really appreciate you coming back on, Geraldo Cadava of Northwestern and the newsletter, Latinos in Depth. Anything else you want to plug? You got any plays about someone coming out anytime soon?
I want to plug you guys. You guys are awesome. Everyone should keep listening to This Day. And thank you for having me on. And I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
I appreciate it. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer. Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia from PRX.